Welcome to our second Reach Minds Thought for Your Life's Journey podcast. In this podcast, we'll be exploring endings through the lenses of loss and grief, and what might be some of the internal changes and psychological transitions that can happen for us, both individually and in organization, and how might this shape and impact our world. Today, I'm joined by my good friend and colleague, Joan Scarrott, whose work and insights have always fascinated me. And when I walk away with our conversation, I think, God, here is something new for me to chew over and to learn about myself. So it's always inspiring and exhilarating. A little bit about Joan. Joan has been working as an independent consultant for over 24 years with individuals and in groups as an OD consultant and an executive coach. Joan uses systems theory and psychodynamic approaches to help senior leaders to reach the next level of their performance. Joan is also a bereavement volunteer, and she also supervises bereavement volunteers. So welcome, Joan, to our second podcast. Now, have I missed anything, Joan, in your introduction?
No, it's very strange listening to somebody introduce you, Nita, because I typically, when I introduce myself, I always start by the fact that I am a mum and I have 3 girls who are now in their late 20s and early 30s, very much defining myself. Been married for 36 years, 36 years,
wow.
just. Yeah, 36 years tomorrow, actually.
Oh, wow.
So, it's very, very strange. But no, thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for adding the personal aspect of you that makes you the different dynamics of you, really. Joan, over the last few years, we've had many, many conversations on various things, and in particular around ending grief and loss. And what I'm really kind of interested in knowing is your curiosity in this area of ending. And when did you become sort of aware of it for the first time in your life?
I love the question, Nita. I really love the question because it does make me reflect on, where did all this start? And I think there are 3 things that I'd like to say, actually. So my grandparents died when I was in my teens, and, people close to me, an aunt died when I was in my teens. But I didn't really think about it. I didn't really reflect on that. But I absolutely remember when I was in my early 20s, I'd left university, gone to Mars on their graduate program. I was in manufacturing, and we were, as a group of manufacturing managers, we were going through a program, which was New Age thinking by a gentleman called Lou Tyson. It was video-based, American. And there was 35 managers in the room. I was one of 2 females. And the gentleman is talking, and I remember him saying, there is only one thing in life that you have to do. And he repeated that. There's only one thing in life that you have to do. And that's die. And I can remember that sentence just like landing in my body. I think it's almost one of the first experiences of where I felt every cell in my body just go, wow. It's like that universal truth. And I really thought about that. And that stayed with me, Nita. And it wasn't a depressing thing. It was actually right. So therefore, everything else is a choice. Everything else is a choice. Now, what was very interesting is that in the conversation afterwards, there was a lot of rejection by people about, no, that's not true. I've got a family, I've got a mortgage, I've got taxes, all that sort of stuff. I just felt the truth of that statement. So that I think that awoke me to choice and death. That's the absolute end, and everything else in between, there is an element of choice. I think the second thing was the death of my parents. So I was 38. I was full-time working. I was traveling. I was still with Mars. And my children at that stage were 6, 4, and 6 months. And my father died just after Christmas. And then my mother died 10 days after that. So basically 2 days after my father's funeral. Neither of them were critically ill. They didn't have conditions that you thought, yeah, this is going to be it. So that was a shock. And I sort of mean a shock in that I sort of recognized not feeling as though it was quite real, that, parents die, but not like this. So that really took me, actually, I went to get some support from Crew's Bereavement Care, who I work alongside now in my bereavement volunteering and in my supervisory work. So that's, I think, the second moment when it was like, right, okay, this is something significant. And then from an organisational perspective, the third incident was I was part of a global team, still with Mars. I was 25 years with Mars. And we'd been a part of this team for nearly 10 years. It was 12 managers looking at the learning and development about what made Mars from a culture perspective and the management input to that. And for good reason, the group was split up into 3 regions, the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific. And that was painful, Nita.
What made it painful?
Really painful. People I'd worked with for best part of 10 years, all of a sudden now there was no reason. When the phones would go around 12:30, 1 o'clock in Europe, and we knew that the States were up, that all of that, just that silence disappeared. Those people, there was no legitimate business reason to contact these people. There was the practices of, we would do work, we would hand it on to Asia Pacific, they would hand it on to the Americas, we would get it back. All of that cycle of intimate working globally just was no longer needed. And I really, really felt the tearing apart of relationships and the demand, if you like, not in a horrible way, but the demand of the organisation to sort of turn on a sixpence and go, right, now it's just Europe. And I found myself really struggling. So that made me curious about endings in organisations when we do organisational structure work, endings in real life, and maybe by being with death and endings, what can that give us? What might that give us that's positive, that gives us energy to go forward? So, those 3 things. So thank you for the question, because it's good to reflect on that.
Well, what I'm sort of curious about, just kind of building on a couple of the areas that you sort of spoke about, the profound impact you had at the age of 21 at Mars. I'm curious about, and you talked about choice, and we're linking this to internal changes and psychological transition. I wonder if you can sort of elaborate a little bit around having recognized this choice. All you have is choice. How did that sort of shape you going forward? What did you observe in yourself, and what were some of the internal changes that you observed in others?
I think one of the most significant aspects around choice and death for me was around going with a process, an internal process, which is inbuilt in all of us. So as human beings, when we lose something that we care about, we love, we value, we grieve. And we see that and we honor that in the animal world. You know, how many people have shared what happens with a group of elephants when one of the elephants dies? We seem very happy to share those amazing things that people capture on film in the natural world. And yet somehow when we think about death, it's often something we push away or suppress or diminish or make shrink. That whole natural experience of grieving is something that is sometimes difficult to face. And I think in the organisational world, if I move into that space, one of the things that I've observed is that we're quite frightened of grief in organisations. And therefore, we try to sometimes ignore it. I think my experience is that we've got a little bit better in some organisations following COVID, because COVID was such an extreme experience with death back on our televisions every day, in our radios, in our online news streams. I think some organisations did a beautiful job of bringing people back into organisational systems and structures. And some, it was almost like a wrench. It's like, this has not happened. So I do think we're getting a bit better at saying this is what happens to human systems. So when I think about it now, I think about how can we acknowledge that this is part of our process? And how can we support it? How can we validate it? How can we help people be okay? The fact that they are being, for example, restructured, and some of the relationships that they've really valued in a business sense are no longer required going forward.
So in a way, you're saying is that for people, whether it's sort of grief individually or in organization, it sometimes could be a tough cookie for us to look at.
Yeah. And I think that the other thing that certainly I've learned through my work supporting grieving people is that we will have often many losses in our lives. And at some point, something happens. And a person then comes and says, I'd like some help. And one of the things that often happens is that the presenting grief is not always the grief that actually is the place where the person wants to start. So, within 10, 15 minutes, they talk about other things. I mean, I can remember a very profound experience of a lady, and I was called in to support her in the death of her husband. And in the first 15 minutes, one of the questions I sometimes ask is this your first significant loss? And she said, no. And in that moment, tears bounced out of this lady's eyes like I've never experienced before. And she talked about the death of, she had 2 children, and she talked about the death of her daughter, a very young daughter. And the death of her husband had connected to it. So that's where we started. So, we carry these things around with us, Nita. And I think that's one of the scary things for organizations, the fear of, oh, crikey, if we go into this, how do we contain it? How do we control it? And I don't think it is controllable. I think we can allow it to come forward. And, there's that famous saying, isn't there, this too shall pass. And to some extent, it will pass. The emotion will pass. And in the meantime, the person gets validated. It's okay. It's okay. And these things don't go away. I mean, you and I have talked on a few occasions, Nita, about, death. when we talk about it from the personal sense, it's not like any other disappointment. You don't get over it. And we know that now. What happens is we go through it, and through doing that, we find some energies in ourselves to then start to rebuild our lives around the death. It doesn't shrink. But I love that. I love that metaphor, because one of the people that I really value in this space is a gentleman called Frank Ostaseski, and he talks about, so he opened first Zen Buddhist hospice in San Francisco many years ago. And in his book, 5 Invitations, he has a beautiful sentence, which is, death is the silent teacher in plain sight. And I think that's, for me, one of the things that I have valued by stepping into this space. I have met, either through their writing or personally, some incredible people who have opened this death and life space, and they're not separated. They are absolutely connected, and that's that's a gift.
Ooh. And I just want to kind of pick that up. I love that quote. Death is the secret teacher hiding in plain sight. I absolutely love that, and thank you for introducing me to that. How can us as individuals, or even in organizations, I hear you sort of saying losses are accumulative as we go through our lives, and I recognize that in myself. How can we be more conscious or cognizant that a loss has happened, irrespective of how big or small it is?
One of the experiences I have sometimes in organizations, Nita, is that we become super busy. And I think the way in which organizations now have integrated Zoom as part of the way in which we work, I think one of the first things that we can do is just slow down a bit. Slow down a bit and notice what is going on inside our bodies. And then if we are in positions of leadership, start to notice what's happening with people. Start to notice who is in the room and who is engaging with the meeting, who is distracted.
So Joan, just to kind of pick up your saying around how individuals, there are losses that are happening accumulatively. How can we honor and acknowledge the losses that are happening in our lives?
So there's a gentleman called Stephen Jenkinson who says that grief is a skill. Grieving is a skill that we can learn. So I think the first thing that we can do, Nita, is educate ourselves around grief. And there's lots of fantastic authors in that space. Frank Ostaseski, very accessible. Joan Halifax, Catherine Mannix. These are all really good writers that we can pick up any of their books and start to muse on that.
Is there sort of piece of wisdom that you can leave people thinking about as we sort of end our session today?
2 things come to mind, Nita. I think the first one is grieving is a really natural process. And when somebody or a group is grieving, one of the things that we can do is validate that process by listening. And there's a beautiful little poem by a gentleman called Nick Askew, who has something called Soul Biographies. And it's just I'll just read it because it's sort of, again, one of those poems. When I heard it first time, I was like, yeah, it went into my body, into my spirit. And he says, before your words of encouragement and well-timed advice, before items gifted at beyond an arm's length, did you ever consider the one thing that might turn the entire world on its axis? Your undivided and so still attention. And I really love that point, because it's just a reminder of the power of just simply your presence, your full presence. And I think the other thing that came up is a quote by Angeles Arian that I came across recently from a dear friend of mine called Emma Pearson. And Angeles Arian is an anthropologist who I have followed. And the quote says, "We travel through life with two companions, death and destiny. Death continually asks us, are you using the great gift of life well? Destiny whispers, are you doing what you've come here to do?"
For me, this has been a really, really powerful podcast in terms of the experience around grief, loss, and endings. So thank you so much for your time and your wisdom that you've shared in this session with me.
Nita, thank you. It's good to see you.